Welcome to Racism and Anti-Racism in Sport online conversation series. This is the 10th week in our series, and this series of events are organized by Bomovu, Alan Savunması, and all seminars with the support of FAIR Network. In this series, we try to address racist practices in sport, how racism takes place within the sport field, and what are the anti-racist practices in sports that build solidarity, empowerment, and also create an alternative space for all the racialized identities. And this week's topic is sport anti-racism and the problem of white supremacy. And we are very proud to host Aarti Ratna and Kola Adeosun as guest speakers. Uh, Before leaving the floor to our speakers, I will briefly introduce them. Dr. Aarti Ratna is an Associate Professor of Sociology at Solent University, UK. Her work focuses upon anti-racist and transnational feminist readings of sport, leisure, and popular culture, particularly as it relates to explore the pleasures and desires of women of the South Asian diaspora. Kola Adeosun is undertaking his PhD in educational philosophy and sport development, alongside teaching on the UG sport coaching and development course at Solent University, UK. Alongside his academic career, Kola has a wealth of practitioner experience, having worked in sport in Africa, the UK, the Caribbean, and the USA as a coach, researcher, development officer, and consultant. Now I will leave the microphone to Aarti. You may start whenever you're ready.
I will just share my screen.
Okay.
Do you want to say hi, Kola?
Hi everyone, great to be on here, and I'll speak a little bit more in the next sort of 10-15 minutes, but I'll leave the floor to Aarti to get us on the way.
All right, thanks, Kola. I'm really pleased to be here, and I want to thank Selçuk for inviting Kola and I to take part in this series. You know, it's a really timely and important series, and I think, you know, the remit of what they're trying to do is to have a discussion. It's really important that actually we have this discussion and we continue to have it. So in the spirit of, you know, dialogue, you know, Kola and I are going to speak about sport anti-racism and the challenges of white supremacy. Now, I started with this slide, and I'm not a Star Trek fan by any means. I'm more like Star Wars. But when I saw this, it made me think about, you know, the opening titles to Star Trek, going boldly where nobody has been before. Now, I'm not going to claim Kola and I are going somewhere that nobody's been before, because other people have talked about the issues around challenging white supremacy. But, you know, when we do go to places that are quite often places where we're scared to go, you know, the things that we're scared to talk about, the fears that we have, the things that we don't vocalize about the way we see the world, you know, I feel like we have to take ourselves to those places. And often when we talk about things around white privilege, you know, if I'm usually in a classroom or in a conference, you can start feeling and seeing people twitch. And, you know, I'm not racist, but I'm not calling you racist. We're just talking about white privilege. But I want everyone, including myself and Kola, to sit in this sort of uncomfortable space of going into a dialogue about things that might make us feel uncomfortable. And, you know, white supremacy, I feel like, is one of those things. And so in the sort of spirit of Chicana Feminist Insights, Gloria Andaluza, I see this being in this space of discomfort as an opportunity to derive embodied and emotional logic, which can begin to plot a map and a direction for how we can begin to radically action and change the white supremacy structures of sport in a way that's beneficial for us all. So I've currently been reading this just amazing book by Fred Moten and Stefano Harney called Undercommons, Fugitive Planning and Black Study. And, you know, I've really sort of taken to it because I think it speaks my language. So there's a fucking shit in every single sentence and it just makes me laugh. Pardon my French for anyone that might have been offended by that. But one of the reasons I love it is because it encourages us, you know, as I said, in the Chicana feminist traditions, to find the crevices and the gaps, you know, in spaces of our academic world or in the sporting institutions, to kind of begin to plan our sort of fugitive resistance. And the contradiction is that for many of us, we still have to earn a living in that space. So how can you plan to bring the shit down when you're in the shit, so to speak? So it's a conundrum and a contradiction that many in sport may be able to relate to. How to exist in the sporting world, but to bring down some of the, you know, contemporary issues around racism and white supremacy that continue to plague it. And when we bring it down, what do we want to replace it with? You know, if we want to replace sport in its modern context, what would that look like? And how we would make sure equity was at the center of its machination. So Kola and I, in our conversation, you know, we want to think about how we're going to bring the shit down. And we're going to start very briefly by introducing sport and the utility of recent anti-racist campaigns. We're then going to provide a deeper understanding of anti-Black racism and what we mean by the term white supremacy. And then we're going to talk about how to challenge white supremacy by inviting the voices and experiences of the oppressed. Okay, and then we'll go into conversation with the audience, which I hope will spark some discussion about how they perceive the utility of sport in tackling racism and white supremacy. Oh, hang on. Okay. So at the weekend, some of you may be aware that the Black British motor racing world champion, Lewis Hamilton, won the Formula One Grand Prix again for the 100th time. I don't know, because I'm not a massive, well, I used to be, but not anymore, a fan of motor racing. And on the podium and around the spaces of the track, he was seen by a global audience of millions of people wearing this T-shirt, which on the back said, "Say her name," and a picture of Breonna Taylor. And on the front, it said, "When will the police who killed Breonna Taylor be arrested?" And, you know, while this is just like, you know, so poignant to talk about the killing of Black people in America, I have this little irritation with Lewis Hamilton, and I don't know what it is, and I don't know whether it's because of his sporting persona or because of his sort of elite, wealthy background, but I'm just not a fan of him. And I really want to be a fan of him. But when I saw this image, I thought, you know what, good for him to not only prior to this take to the streets of London to protest alongside thousands of people during the COVID-19 crisis, when it, you know, in the UK, we went into lockdown earlier in March. But, you know, you could see him walking the streets alongside other people, you know, fully masked up. And I don't know if anybody else saw it, but when I saw him, I just thought, God, he looks a bit gangster, doesn't he? And his style and his attitude, it all kind of reflected this kind of sentiment that we're not going to take this shit anymore. And, you know, I did love that about him for doing it. And, you know, for this, I'm so happy that he's not just talking about the police violence against Black men. he's talking about the brutality against Black women, which, a week before George Floyd was murdered, Breonna Taylor was shot down. But, we're still waiting for justice for her and her family. And I felt really it was important to say her name. And I do respect Lewis for doing that. So I found myself questioning, what is it about Lewis that's irking me here? And I was thinking that, what does it take for a Black British athlete to, call out this social injustice? Does it take the death of African-American men and women? And I've thought, what about all the Black young people in Britain who are incarcerated, who are killed, and who are unfairly stopped and searched? Or the urban areas which are hit by poverty and austerity and where life is pretty shit. And what about the long-term citizens, people like Lewis's dad, who as a, I think, first generation British Caribbean citizen, how would he feel if his dad was sent back to a country that he never knew, despite being a British citizen and not knowing anything about the place where his parents had grown up or lived? And, all of this started to make me feel really sad, because some of the racial injustices are so deeply embedded in the history of our society and sport. I was thinking, why didn't he say something before? Why didn't he do something before? And actually, I don't want to just pick on Lewis, but, what I want to talk about is the individualized nature of some anti-racist practice in sport, particularly. And it makes me think about some of the wider anti-racist campaigns that we've had in the UK, where we've seen people donning various banners, paraphernalia, wristbands and T-shirts. And, they're all used to promote this rhetoric that, there's no place for racism in sport. But I sometimes see these paraphernalia as, some sort of individual affirmation, staking a claim to being against racism. But whether you choose to wear that T-shirt or not, it doesn't mean racism is a thing of the past, or that some of the athletes who choose to wear that T-shirt, that racism isn't an issue that's between them, between teammates, between fans, and between people who work in the sports governing industry. So in the UK, such symbolic interventions initially started by campaign groups like Kick Racism Out of Football, who was subsequently named Kick It Out. And whilst there have been some wins, and I don't want to knock them because they have done a lot to raise awareness around racism in football, and there has potentially been a decline in overt sounds of racism at the highest levels of the game, although we still hear it. I'm starting to think about football in the broader sense and capacity. And arguably, without the resources and the staffing, and mainly funded by the English Football Association, and I want to thank Connor Penfold for sending me his paper yesterday, how much can organisations like Kick It Out actually hold institutions like the FA to account? When, in not so many words, by taking the FA's cash to fund their projects, it's like sleeping with the enemy. So how can they actually do anything that's going to hold the FA to account when they're accepting this dirty money? Maybe I shouldn't call it. So I want to take a moment here before I move on, because in the spirit of Say Her Name, I want to take a moment to call out, say her name, Eniola Aluka. And I respect you massively for taking it to the fucking man. That is the white male machine that is the English Football Association. And I just feel it shouldn't have been a solo project for you to get the racial justice that you deserved. And you had to fight long and hard to be vindicated and to be proven as the one that was telling the truth. And, you know, it's part of an anti-Black culture at large, where Black people, so in Eni's a case as an African woman, but Black in terms of African and Caribbean, you know, where their abilities to offer a balanced or truthful version of events is checked in a way that is not checked of other white people, or in this case, the white male manager, Mark Sampson, who, as we found out, she rightly accused him of being racist, but it had to take a government select committee to overturn and announce the FA as being guilty of institutional racism. And she's one person. And I just think, oh my God, what about all the other young Black men and women who want to play sport, to get racial justice for them in this institution? Oh my God, you know, would they have the legal background like Eni did, and the emotional support and network to take it to the fucking man? So we can't do it by ourselves. So it makes me think about how, you know, we do it together. Why am my use of PowerPoint so bad? Now, I don't want to go on too much now, because we were going to show you like a video clip where the Premier League, like Kick It Out, have produced a really nice, glossy, wonderful music, wonderful images, all the celebrity footballers. You know, I wonder how much Jamie Vardy got for being in this campaign. It just looks so amazing. And you know what? If I was to buy into this marketed stuff, I'd probably think, oh, yeah, there is no room for racism apart from behind the scenes of this glossy campaign, you know, the prevalence of anti-Black racism. And I think, as others have rightly pointed out in their own research, you know, other forms of racism like cosmopolitan racism, neo-nationalist populism, and, you know, cultural racism and Islamophobia. But we haven't got time to talk about all of those. So I'm going to hand now to Kola, who's going to talk a little bit more about anti-Black racism.
Thank you, Aarti, and thank you to Bovo for inviting us to talk. And obviously, in this difficult global time, I appreciate you all tuning in. Hopefully, we can keep your minds occupied during lockdown. So Aarti mentioned there about sort of anti-Blackness and anti-Black racism, and I guess to kind of give you a bit of a context. I mean, the fact that racism occurs against Black people is not news to anyone, so we know that. But anti-Black racism refers to sort of practices and formative thoughts that both sort of dehumanize Black people and strips Blackness of value. And when we talk about Black and the concept of sort of racism when it relates to Black people, anti-Black racism obviously is the sort of structural and systemic racism endemic within institutions, and it basically refers to how Black people are reduced to the lesser, based on assumptions, and many of these assumptions are inherent in our sort of everyday society, and in our everyday language. And if we look at the language, the institution of language, we can see, so many of these sort of connotations. So as Aarti's put up rightly there, this slide, I mean, now, not for 1 second sort of detailing that these words are inherently racist, because they're not, but what it should do spring to mind about the sort of the negative connotations, that spring to mind when we use the word Black. So we think about, a Black funeral, somber event where, you wear Black. You think about the Black sheep of the family, sort of the odd one out within the family. You think about the Black death, the relation to a plague. You think about sort of a black dog, which is an English kind of idiom saying, which refers to depression, melancholy, sadness. Think about the word blackmail, which refers to obviously ripping someone off. You think about sort of a black cat, which is sort of considered to be deja vu, bad luck. And within these sort of and these are just examples. And within these connotations and constructions, we can see sort of a systematic kind of marginalization of Black people. And I was talking to Aarti about this a couple of days ago, and I was like, oh, you know, if you think about anti-Blackness and we talk about dehumanization, what kind of, could I give an example? And I remember talking to Aarti about my own sort of recent experiences with the police. Like a lot of Black people, I've been pulled over many times. And recently I was pulled over, and I was stopped, and the police officer gave me, he said, oh, do you know why I pulled you over? The classic. And I felt like replying with if anyone knows the Jay-Z song, 99 Problems, when he says, oh, do you know why I pulled you over? I was going to reply with, because I'm young and I'm Black and my hat's real low. But I didn't. I was professional, and I said, oh, actually, I don't know. And he was like, oh, you know, your back left tire is low. And I was like, based on what calculations? And this is where it gets a little bit tricky, because at that point he asked me to step out the car, hand over my keys, and locks my car. So I'm stood on the side of the road, of a busy road. People are driving past, they can see me. I'm stood next to my car, and he's inside his car typing in some stuff. And I'm thinking, well, you know, I mean, is this necessary? Because you pulled me over, you have my number plate. You could just keep me in the car. You know, I'm not gonna, if I'm gonna drive off, you know, you've got my number. I'm not gonna do that. There's no reason for me to stand on the side of the car with you. You've got my keys and you've locked the car. And these kind of subconscious practices we're referring to, these kind of like dehumanization of, you know, this idea that, you know, he's Black, he might run off, you know, well, you've already pulled me over. So these are the kind of anti-Blackness that when we refer to anti-Black racism, these kind of practices which are endemic within our institutions. And when we move on and we look at this sort of these connotations, they lead to what we call, you know, of course, unconscious biases. And then there's some, I put this in because there's some recent examples. So if you think about, you know, I know this is just a Daily Mail, but if you think about, you know, Phil Foden, and, you know, you compare the headlines, you know, the top left one, young Man City footballer. They're basically, you know, similar footballers. I think Raheem Sterling made a comment about this. You know, similar footballers, similar age, playing for the same team. Neither of them have done anything wrong, but you can see how the headlines report, you know, sort of the Black player very differently to the white player. It's just, you know, an unconscious reporting. This is just the institution of media. You think about recently, if you've been keeping up with the news, Marcus Rashford, and, you know, David Beckham, who's done a lot of charity work, a lot of good work in terms of school dinners. And the headline there, what a result. Campaigning football star Marcus Rashford has bought 5 luxury homes. And to be fair to Marcus Rashford, actually, he actually replied to the Daily Mail saying that he's young, he's 23, and he's made some investments to secure his future and looking at housing. But again, you compare this sort of the reporting of David Beckham to Marcus Rashford, and we can see these unconscious biases which still exist within our society. So Aarti made the point earlier on about sort of, are we seeing the back of racism? Well, obviously we clearly haven't. These are just, you know, prominent examples of what we now have today. So I think the question then is, so as Aarti mentioned, is anti-racist action enough? You know, do we need to do more? So, for example, Black Lives Matter is a great sort of global movement, a NEAL movement. It's united a lot of sports under kind of one similar banner. But nothing really changes until we really address white supremacy, and that's what Aarti wants to talk about next, and how do we address this white supremacy? Aarti, you might be on mute.
Yes, I'm on mute. Sorry. Just so, you know, we've had a lot going on in the UK with COVID, austerity, and, you know, different institutions have had different issues around, you know, staff representation in terms of, you know, gender equity and BME representation. And, you know, whether it's in the spaces of sport or academia, it's really hard to talk about white supremacy. And one of the reasons is as I said at the start, quite a few white people end up feeling twitchy, like you're accusing them of being racist. But this is the conversation I think we need to have. And whilst other scholars in sport and education have critiqued white as a racial identity and written about sort of sport and whiteness and how it operates often as a unnamed and neutral category, you know, whiteness has power, and it's a power not to be named. To kind of begin to unpack what I mean by white supremacy, you know, I want to pay homage to others who have written about white supremacy, and particularly my dear friend and colleague, Associate Professor Stan Thangaraj, because it's through his writing and his discussions, it's made me think about white supremacy, not just in terms of, you know, images of white Americans running around with the Confederacy flag or advocating for confederation, or neo-fascist groups who, you know, might want to reclaim the whiteness of their nations, because that makes us think about white supremacy as something that might be extreme. And I want to talk about how white supremacy, you know, it goes beyond white privilege. So it's not just a question about people's racial identities, it's a question about the structures and the cultures and the policies and practice that operate in different institutions, whether it be academia or sport, which means that historically, the way those institutions have developed and who has had power in them has meant that those traditions and spaces are imbued quite often with norms and values which reflect, you know, the people's identities who have power. So a lot of sport is in the image of white middle class straight men. And so, you know, in this space, if you're white, it's easier to fit into it, even though along race and class demarcations, you know, you might feel disadvantaged in different ways. But, you know, I think for Black men and women, particularly of different class backgrounds, you know, their belonging and ability to exert power and to be heard is actually fairly limited. And, you know, my PhD research, which was about British Asian women who play football in the predominantly white context and middle class context of women's football in England, you know, I borrowed the ideas of my amazing PhD supervisor, Nirmal Puwar. And in her book, Space Invaders, Bodies Out of Place, she talks about how, you know, in the spaces of Parliament and Whitehall, which are known to be predominantly patriarchal, white, elite spaces, that for minority ethnic women to exist in this space, you know, it's really difficult because they have to deal with the complex forces of racism, sexism, and elitism. And where others might feel like a fish in water, so white elite men might feel like a fish in water, and others, dependent on their combination of identities, might be able to kind of stay afloat and keep going up the river, so to speak. You know, for many others, they feel like a fish out of water. They're not even in the water. They're bloody being constantly kicked out of the water and having to frantically struggle to keep afloat. And whilst on the surface, you know, you might see them gliding along, you know, underneath the waves and the water, there is a constant and relentless struggle to stay afloat. And I want to talk about this weight of whiteness as a racial force of power that across time and space, Fred Moten, at the quote I used at the start, you know, suggests impacts us all differently. And across other markers of power and control, such as class, gender, sexuality, age, ethnicity-enabled bodiness. So in the spirit of Moten, we need to recognize that, you know, every time we see people in predominantly white spaces, we need to recognize the history and legacy of whiteness on their experience and ability to be in that space. And that when they talk about the shit that goes on for them, to listen. Because you know what? We're not broken. We're not petty. We don't lack professionalism. What we're doing is raising issues that nobody wants to hear. So fucking listen. Because we're not going to bring down this shit if we don't have these difficult dialogues. And some of you might be listening thinking, God, she's off on one, isn't she? Well, I'm off on one because I've had enough of it all, to be honest. And that's why I've got to a point I can't be bothered to be silent anymore. So I might as well say what it is on my mind and the things that give me restless nights and mean that I can't sleep and that I worry about my future and that of my children. We have to speak about the legacies of white supremacy in the here and now, and how through the structures, cultures, policies and practices of institutions of sport and whiteness, how they differentially actually, you know, affect all of us, and that this ain't going to change unless we talk about this. And to talk about this and to understand it, you know, when Kola and I were suggesting talking before, prior to this, we talked about how, you know, to bring down the master's house, or if we like, the oppressor, we kind of have to understand and seek the standpoint, experiences and views of the oppressed. And I'm going to pass to Kola now.
Thank you, Aarti. I won't spend too long talking about the oppressed and the oppressor, but what Aarti was referring to is Paulo Freire, who talked about the nature of humanization and dehumanization, and the lack of sort of consciousness within wider society, and how, you know, we need to get a conscious existence within the wider people, within the masses. He actually says to start to address the issues around dehumanization, and where the oppressed become sort of, along with the oppressors, become one in sort of toppling down the master's house, to use Aarti's analogy. And I wanted to sort of, with that, I wanted to kind of bring something to fore in terms of the nature of sort of how we view sport, society, and racism, I guess, within this kind of lack of consciousness that we have around sort of sport. And I've just done these scales, and they're just my rough guesses. And we kind of, obviously we're on this talk and we're talking about sport, racism and anti sort of whiteness. And Aarti mentioned it earlier on, and she said, I think the word she used was this individual affirmation of racism, and sort of this, and we view racism as this atomized thing where it's an individual thing, and within sport, certainly, sport is a platform where we go, and we've often all heard it said. So, you know, I'll use an example of football, and a football fan is racist or something, or says something at a football game, and then we have this, oh, it's an isolated incident, or it's the uneducated few. And, you know, and then obviously these same football fans, you know, so, you know, these two fans must be going around the country, getting to every football game, shouting things out. So what we have is this sort of imbalanced view of sort of the society's influence on sport and how sport plays into racism, as if, you know, sport, of course, racism, of course, and white supremacy is, of course, an issue in sport, but it's not because of sport. We have societal institutions which need to be looked at, because, again, when we talk about is anti-racism enough, well, we need to tackle the institutions. I mean, people often humanize discrimination, or individualize it, to the point that obviously society focuses on an individual and on an ignorant individual, but we forget that discrimination obviously is individual structures. It's that places a glass ceiling above a whole race of people, as opposed to, so one individual is not the epitome of white supremacy, is what I'm saying. So we need to look at wider structures in society and how we change people's entrenched ways of knowing. Because of course, as Mandela says, I mean, if you think about what he said about the apartheid system, it's not just, it both the people who enact those systems and are the victims of it are both victims of this oppression. And one of the main ways that Paulo Freire talked about in sort of moving things forward was dialogue and societal dialogue. And again, Aarti mentioned it earlier on, where sort of when you mention racism, around why people get twitchy, but actually, we need to make racism this kind of non-taboo subject where we have societal discussions and societal dialogue and conversations about, what the meaning of white privilege is and how to educate people on white privilege and how we drive anti-racism policies that are effective and actually progress this field forwards. And I think with that, perhaps we can open it up to questions. Thank you.
Thanks, Kola. Thanks, Aarti. It was a really great talk, and I can really listen to you, both of you, for hours. And I can say personally, it made me think that I should do more, just based on what you just said here. Before allowing our participants to ask questions, maybe I can start and ask the first question to both of you. I'll take you out of your focus a little bit, but maybe it's not. Maybe you can bring it back. So I want to ask you about the white ignorance, and it allows to bypass and mystify racial awareness and develop innovative colorblind logics that foreclose the outcomes of racially conscious learning. White ignorance deliberately denies to learn and understand racial issues. Would you like to talk about how this conscious ignorance or the act unknown plays a role to keep the white supremacy alive in sports or in general, however you would like to answer?
Do you want to take that, Aarti?
Oh, you were going to do something you were going to speak about unconscious bias, so why don't you expand, and then if I want to add, I will.
Okay, yeah, sure. So you asked about white ignorance and sort of how it denies its legitimacy within wider society. I think there's two parts to your question. I think if we look at sort of, you mentioned conscious ignorance. If we look at conscious ignorance, well, we can't call it ignorance if it's conscious. If that makes sense. So it's not ignorance if it's conscious. So when we say conscious ignorance, it's a paradox, I guess. But to flip that round and say white ignorance, I think white ignorance, if we look at the term ignorance, I think, and the fact that people don't like to educate themselves is as much a fault of like I said, the institutions where individuals come from, because they're not educated on this white ignorance or white privilege, which they have. Because if we talk about it in society, a lot of people actually don't know what white privilege is. So a lot of people, they don't understand that white privilege is something that exists within society. So I think when you ask how do we educate, or how do we get people to understand that this ignorance exists and these kind of unconscious approaches and thoughts exist in our society, I think we need to look at again where perhaps to take a Freirean view, because I'm studying Freire, we need to look at our education systems and how they build and are built from the view of sort of whiteness, which further legitimize sort of white ignorance, as opposed. So we need to tear those down and restructure them towards a much more humanizing form to include all people. Do you want to add anything, Aarti?
Yeah, so I was just going to say there's a book by Robin DiAngelo called White Fragility. And in that book, she talks about why it's so hard to talk about whiteness and white privilege. And it's not just a notion of ignorance, because as Kola said, some of it is consciousness, but it's also sometimes a denial that the person who might be feeling or experiencing racism is actually feeling and experiencing those things. So, how do you qualify racism in a society where, it's quicker and easier to actually challenge it ever even existed, and that somebody's lived experiences of it are real. And so then it makes me think about subconscious bias, because, you know, there might be things that are ingrained in our own socialization, family life, and education systems, etc. But what I think about that is, you know, there are people out there who I've met who work in sport who do genuinely come and speak to me and say, Aarti, you know, I want to learn. I know I need to do better. And as somebody with power in my institution, I want to, you know, I want to make a difference. Can you talk to me about how I can do that? And on one hand, it's like, yes, I will absolutely talk to you. But then on the other hand, this becomes like a burden where certain, you know, scholars who face sort of their own experiences of racism and exclusion then have to become the educators, you know, of even the most well-intentioned people. So sometimes I think, you know, there's also other things you can do. And it is like Kola said, it's educating yourself. But let's be fair, some of the educators that we have in institutions of university are also, you know, unable or unwilling to address their white power. And, you know, they can teach it, but can they reflect on themselves? Can they reflect on how they might be holding up whiteness in our institutions through their complicity, their lack of action, and their silence? Because what we get there is then we get an education system where whiteness as a hierarchical thing continues to operate. So part of me thinks if you want an education, go to a Kala, go to somebody outside of the institution of education, and you can learn. Look at all the community artwork, you know, that we have and we can see. And I love Shikana feminist work, and I showed you some artwork in the last slide. I love that. In that artwork, you are hearing the voices of oppressed people in the community, and they will teach you, you know, by looking at it and learning from it, you will learn so much. So yeah, that's my response to that question.
Thanks. Now I have to speak louder. I guess my microphone doesn't work very good. Are there any questions from our listeners? You can just turn on your video and ask your question, and also turn on your microphone as well. Anybody? Okay.
We did such a great job. There's no questions.
I had a quick question. Before that, I wanted to thank you for the great presentations and for this conversation. Thank you so much. My question was about international solidarity networks and how you see these networks, their significance in the work of dismantling white supremacy.
Go first, Aarti.
Yeah, so as you were speaking, I was thinking about things like Black Lives Matter and the Me Too movement. And some of these networks appear as if they've only just started. And, you know, when I think of the Me Too movement, for example, it was amazing. You know, all these women from different parts of the world went on a march to kind of call out the sexual abuse and misogyny of so many, you know, social institutions, not just of the filmic one, but, you know, of the spaces of power and the filmic industries. And so on one hand, I thought, yes, we're going to open a conversation. And, you know, that conversation is going to hopefully lead to change and women, you know, being able to, you know, have rights around their bodies when it's been violated. But part of this movement, one of the things that kind of irked me was the fact that there had been a long legacy of traditions of Black women who have been fighting against violence against women of color, whether it's from the police, from education institutions, from being incarcerated. You know, you get Black women who come here looking for freedom and are incarcerated in Yarlswood. And, you know, this long legacy of a movement, and it was started by Tarana Burke, but, you know, other Black women of color have been talking about this and activating on their own for such a long time. And so to kind of make sure we're an inclusive movement, I think it's important to remember those histories and to remember those voices. And when we start movements, don't just, you know, oh, look at us, we're doing this jolly thing. You know, there's been a history and a legacy before that. But as I say, to kind of then maximize those international networks of solidarity, it requires ongoing conversations beyond the spectacle. And those are the conversations that can be difficult to have. So in terms of the white women's movement, a constant tension has been in terms of racial and class and issues around sexuality, and how the women's movement can incorporate, you know, women as a whole. And what we find is that a lot of the policies are still very much quite narrow. And so, you know, there has to be more done to actually challenge also the whiteness of women's movements. Kola?
Yeah, no, I agree. I mean, I think you're 100% spot on there. I think when I looked at the Me Too movement, I think obviously it's fantastic and it addresses, you know, male, I don't know, the term doesn't come to mind, sort of male dominance, I guess is probably the right term, but sort of in varied industries. And I think certainly brought to my attention sort of my own sort of unconscious biases of being a male, because obviously as being a Black male, sometimes you kind of forget, you know that I still have a lot of privilege as a male. So absolutely, these networks are influential, and I think Aarti is 100% right. In especially with the Me Too, I think, and I remember sort of during the Me Too campaign, I remember sort of, and I have to go back and double check this, but I remember sort of keeping an eye on the Me Too movement and Harvey Weinstein, and to my knowledge, till this day, Harvey Weinstein actually apologized for all the women he supposedly violated, apart from two, which were Salma Hayek and Lupita, the two women of color. And I have checked it, but maybe not to my own discredit, not to the degree I would have liked. But I have checked whether the Me Too movement have picked up on that and gone, well, you know, come on, you know. So when Aarti talks about sort of the whiteness of these movements, sometimes we can get lost in these amazing movements, which they are good, of course they are, but sometimes in that sort of not excitement, but that kind of, you know, forward movement, we can sometimes leave these sort of, again, more Black women, more marginalized people behind. So yeah, so I think it's, again, looking at those institutions themselves and kind of looking at how they can also, because they're good, these networks are good, but they're not perfect, I guess, is the way forward there. There is another question about Terence Crawford, I saw, the boxer. He was in a fight this weekend.
Yeah, that was for me. Can I just interject? Okay. I just want to give an example of the structural forms of white supremacy and how it even affects a very successful boxer, one of the sports that I cover. And I don't know how familiar people are with Terence Crawford, but he's considered by many of us the #1 pound-for-pound fighter in the world, and those that don't have him at #1 have him #2 or 3. Virtually everybody that follows boxing says that. He's an undefeated welterweight, but he has had difficulty getting other top welterweights to fight him, because those welterweights are with other rival TV networks or promotional companies. So he recently beat over the weekend Kell Brook, who's on the back end of his career, and now you're starting to see all these criticisms coming to Terence Crawford. Why doesn't he fight Errol Spence? Why doesn't he fight Manny Pacquiao, who's also in the end of his career? Why doesn't he fight Keith Thurman, Sean Porter, and so forth? And the fact is Terence Crawford is a boxer. He's not a TV network or streaming service executive. He's not a promoter. He's not a manager. And knowing boxers, he would fight anybody. He would fight Godzilla if you put, Godzilla in front of him. So now Terence Crawford's promoter, Bob Arum, said, well, I don't know if I can make money with this guy, and maybe we'll release him. And they're engaged in this huge public spat. It's the structure of boxing, which is mainly white supremacist, that is holding up the best fighting the best. It's not Terence Crawford's fault. And I'm seeing a lot in the people in the boxing media trying to point the finger at Terence Crawford and saying negative things about him, when it's the overall structure that is dysfunctional and different from most other sports, where you usually have the best compete against the best. That's kind of one example. I mean, the other obvious example is the fighters that are not known to the public, not Terence Crawford's. It's won undefeated and won all these accolades, that go by the wayside after boxing, have virtually nothing. Many of them live destitute lives, short lives, and just have to try to survive with no health insurance or anything like that. So there are a lot of structural things. And so that's why I think it's important when you examine these things. Yes, there's the aspect of the out and out, as was said earlier, the out and out white supremacists and neo-Nazis and the Klan and so forth and so on. But there's a structural setup that works against the black athletes. And that's just one example that came up in the last couple of days I wanted to talk about. So I could discuss maybe afterwards more about the situation if people aren't that familiar with Terence Crawford in boxing, because it's so badly run. But I just wanted to point that out.
Yeah, thanks, Eddie. Yeah, I actually followed boxing as a novice, and I've kind of kept up without knowing, I kind of know vaguely the structure of boxing, but I've kind of kept up with what's been going on with Terence Crawford as a boxing fan. See, I'm a fan and I like him, and I watched the fight on the weekend, and I've been keeping up with sort of this public spat with Bob Arum, and sort of, well, I thought Bob Arum said he can't make any more money, or what did he say? He's not going to lose any more money on Terence Crawford, and Terence Crawford has actually hit back in the media. But I think, yeah, you're absolutely right. It's the structure and these structural form, these institutional racism that forms boxing obviously limits Terence Crawford, and I think is, again, feeds nicely into what me and Aarti have been talking about. Yeah, absolutely, absolutely great example.
Oh, okay. Maybe I can ask one last questions before we close the conversation, or maybe someone else can ask. We can have a few more questions if you want to ask. But I want to ask Aarti, or both of you actually, like, how important is the solidarity amongst minoritized communities to challenge white supremacy in the sports field? I remember, Aarti, you in one of your previous works, you talked about how British Asian young footballers are empowered by the cultural resistance forms of black girls. Can you elaborate on this a little bit and in relate to our question?
Start with what the question was again.
Just how important is the solidarity amongst minoritized communities to challenge white supremacy?
To begin with, that solidarity is not necessarily without tension, and I think that's important to recognize, because when I did my PhD research, a group of young girls, one of the reasons that they felt they could kind of challenge racism on and off the field of play is because they had each other's backs, and that's how they spoke about it, and we're not going to be knocked like this. And through their sort of language and performance, there was a resistance to racism that they produced on and off the field. But you know, the thing was, even within that group, there were issues and tensions. So some of the girls were seen as being more girly girls, some of the others were positioned as tomboys. And, you know, that also created sometimes tensions, which actually, you know, the girls had to negotiate. But I think, therefore, what I'm trying to say is in any kind of sort of, you know, gathering or community of resistance, there always will be tensions, but we have to just find ways to work through the tension rather than let that tension kind of dissipate and stop us, you know, fighting the important fights in that moment. And then and that means sometimes you have to let go of your other fights to fight what your friend is fighting, kind of thing. And then, you know, some of the girls that I spoke to, yeah, they very much adopted this rude girl style, and I just loved them. And, you know, they'd grown up as first, second generation British at a time when, you know, hip hop music, style and fashion, you know, was just part of their everyday vernacular. It was just part of how we grew up. And I say we because I grew up in that era too. So, you know, this kind of youth identity became part of their politics. And, you know, they would say, if somebody tackles me, I'm going to tackle them right back. And, you know, they would go in for the tackle hard. And, you know, they would talk about how they're not going to take people saying bullshit to them. You know, they had this confidence that I am second generation citizen. I'm a citizen of this country, and being a citizen brings rights. So don't mess with me. So, you know, I mean, I loved all of that. But, you know, there's only, so I think, yeah, sometimes we've got to sit in our sort of groups and recognize that there are tensions and gaps, and there's not one way to do it. And the girls adopted a rude girl style. The others kind of, you know, did it on the field of play. But, you know, how I think the most important thing is we can start making change when those who do not look like us join our battles. You know, because like those girls, even though there were tensions, they had each other and the support of somebody who looked like them. But our struggles will become easier in sport or any other social institution when we get the backing of those who don't look like us and those who are in power to help us take it to the man, or to take it to the man themselves, because they know that this improving any kind of environment and making it democratic, you know, is more likely to make it a successful environment, a happier one.
Any comments, Kola, you would like to add?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think for me, I think Aarti's 100% right there. I think not just solidarity is very important. I think, you know, I think there's a quote I'm thinking of. I think it's by Margaret Mead that said, "Never doubt that a group of committed individuals will change the world. Indeed, it's the only thing that ever has." So I think I think when the point is that it's a group of committed individuals. So it's never one individual. It's a group. So solidarity is really important. But Aarti's 100% right. Nothing really changes until people outside of those immediate groups who also, and Fred talks about this, until everybody's on side, the oppressor and the oppressor on side, that actually there is an unjust world order. That's when, you know, so, you know, that solidarity has to be uniform across all groups, which then things start to change. So yeah, Aarti's 100% right, until people that don't look like us.
Thanks. Okay, there is one question from Akila. I will read it out loud. You have provided a number of great resources regarding white supremacy. Do you have any resources, books, podcasts, etc., organizations or strategies to support Black girls, women, and Black boys, men navigate the institutional terrain in this moment?
Oh, a killer. I wish you could give it to me. I'm looking for it. I noted the work of Layla Saeed, who talks about white supremacy in me. But I actually think that isn't a resource for Black men and women. It's a resource for white people. And even Robin DiAngelo's book, White Fragility, wasn't for Black girls and boys. It was to educate the white people that surround them. But, I think, you inspire me massively. And when you play your songs, which I love about your work, the music inspires me. And I think if we were to treat music as a cultural text, there's actually lots of things that can help Black young men and women, to care for themselves and to find comfort, and even to stimulate their sociological imagination, dare I say. And I always return, for me, and if it helps anyone else, who are the writers who make it seem possible? Who are the writers who just take it and tell it how it is and just give you hope? And I feel like, Bell Hooks, Audre Lorde, Gloria Andalusia, Maria Lugones, Chandra Tapaldi, Mahanti, there's so many. And it's these women and their words, it can reduce me to tears. But you know what? It makes me also give me the strength to survive. And it's like Audre Lorde says, your silence will not protect you. So you might as well speak out. If that wasn't an invitation to fuck things up, I don't know what is.
Okay, thank you, Aarti. I think we can now end our conversation here, especially for we can cut the YouTube line right now, maybe. Okay, thanks everyone. Thanks Aarti. Thanks Kola for joining us, and thanks for all the.
Hi to the YouTubers. What other channels are we on?
Just YouTube.
Oh, right. Bye, YouTubers. My son is going to be so jealous